my pleasure to introduce Dr. Swagger, who is ready to go. Okay, now I am going to get school teacherish, and I'm not a school teacher. Y'all in the back, thank you so much. Let's give our due attention to Dr. Swagger. Here she is going to present with us on why the British turned south. And I was fascinated with your story of growing up and hearing about the Southern campaigns in high school in Canada. Fabulous. Everybody, let's welcome Dr. Swagger.
It's always a pleasure to be here, to make new friends, to see old folks and old friends, and for me, my old friends. Now, I did not pick this topic. 2 years ago, I spoke on how England lost the American Revolution. And afterwards, George Summers said, your next topic is why did the British return to the South? Now, I go way, way back with George Summers, and those of you who know him know that when the Colonel speaks, you say, yes, sir. And so I did. I also remember that George insisted that we keep our presentations to 45 minutes. And I intend to do that today. Now, in 1976, Queen Elizabeth II addressed the bicentennial in Philadelphia. And she said, we lost the American colonies because we lacked the statesmanship to know the manner and time of yielding what it was impossible to keep. But she also added, in history, small events when handled insensitively will lead with terrible inevitability to great disaster. So today I'm going to address some of those small events and a few large events that will answer the question, why did the British return to the South? Now, I am not an historian. I am a storyteller, although I try to keep the historical record. Now, a story needs heroes and villains, and we all have our own heroes for the Revolution. And I think we can agree that our villain is King George III. Now, during the Revolution, there were opportunities to sort of dial down the hostility and maybe make some accommodations, and the king always refused. So I wondered, why was he so vicious and inflexible? So I wanted to take a look at him at his early life. Now, he was born in 1738, and he was the son of Prince Frederick, who was the heir apparent, and the ruler at the time was young George's grandfather, George II. Now, George II despised his son Frederick, and this is what he said of him. He was the greatest liar, the greatest canaille, the greatest ass, the greatest beast in the whole world, and we heartily wished him out of it. That sounds a little callous, but Frederick was an habitual gambler, and his temper and arrogance were notorious, and it is said, quote, he looked on all men and women as creatures he might kick or kiss for his own diversion, unquote. And then he was married to Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. And it is said of her, quote, the princess was a woman of virtuous character and strong emotion, but of only a limited intelligence. Now, I'm not going to speculate about what kind of marriage that might have been, but it produced young George. Now, this virtuous woman decided that the way to keep her son, virtuous and poor, was to keep him isolated from the wicked world. And so he was sort of sequestered. And one writer said he was raised in a state of social quarantine. Now, she did provide a tutor. And as a student, young George was, quote, apathetic, sleepy, dull and backward, and unable to read properly until he was 11 years old. Now, this is the family of the future George III. And I think we would be justified in suggesting that this is one dysfunctional family. Now, King George hated his son, Frederick, and wished him dead. And he got his wish because Frederick died in 1751. This put young George in line for the monarchy. He was now 13 years old, and his grandfather, knowing this strange life that this child had been raised in, took him from his mother and brought him to Hampton Court. There he is surrounded by tutors and experts and scholars to teach him what he needs to know to become a monarch. And King George II intended for this child to learn to reign, not rule, but reign. And that would require that he learn how to deal with Parliament. He also wanted him to be cognizant of European history and European situation, because what happened in Europe, especially regarding the French, would have an impact on the British Empire. King George II was very much aware of that, and he wanted his successor to be aware of that. Now, the situation was harsh compared to the very pampered existence he had in his mother's house. Now remember, he wasn't an enthusiastic student. He had just learned to read, and after 3 years of instruction, he had learned very little, and his grandfather returned him to his mother. Now I expect that King George II had decided that apples don't fall far from the tree. George was 16. Now he was again sequestered, and a confidant of Princess Augusta, Lord Bute, became his tutor and a father figure. Now Lord Bute probably was responsible for improving young George's education. However, he was exposed to the shared prejudices of his mother and Lord Bute, and they hated King George II. And they thought the Whig Party needed to be destroyed to protect the empire, and they especially hated Sir William Pitt. Now, King George II was correct in that what happened in Europe would affect his empire. And war was declared in 1756. In Europe, we call it the 7 Years' War. And it pitted Britain and its allies against the French and their allies. Now, hostilities extended into North America, where we call that war the French and Indian War. Now, for the British and their allies, the war was conducted by Sir William Pitt, who was the leader of the Whig Party. And he is considered in British history as the greatest wartime leader ever. Now, of course, Winston Churchill might disagree with that, but Pitt was worried about the possibility of the French Navy attacking the British colonies. And because the largest fortification that the French had was at Louisbourg, which is on Cape Breton Island, off the coast of Nova Scotia, which juts out into the North Atlantic Ocean. Now, that fortification was made of stone. Artillery, heavy guns all around it, 7,000 French troops inside, and it was considered impregnable. And Pitt thought otherwise. And he assembled a huge force of 40 warships and transport ships, and he transported 40,000 British regulars, and they were then joined by some units of Rogers Rangers from the colonies, and they attacked Louisbourg. Louisbourg fell on the 26th of July. Louisbourg surrendered. Now, with this British victory, they had control of Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, which would include the area we now call New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. But even more important, it gave them access to the St. Lawrence River and the possibility of using the St. Lawrence River to go up and attack the fortified cities of Quebec and Montreal. Now, the problem with the St. Lawrence River was that it iced in the winter. So they waited until the next spring, and British troops under General Wolfe had met the French at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, and General Wolfe defeated the Marquis de Montcalm. Now, both commanders were mortally wounded, and I thought this was interesting. Wolfe's last words are reported to have been, "Now God be God be praised, I will die in peace." And Montcalm's were, "Well, so much the better, I won't see the British in Quebec." Now, knowing that Montreal would be a long siege, the British withdrew, but they came back the next year and attacked Montreal. Now, that was a walled and well-defended city, and the military commander was determined that he would fight till the last man. But with the casualties arising, and especially civilians, the French Governor General, who was there, Pierre Vaudreuil, surrendered Montreal and all of New France. In other words, what we know as French Canada would be now British. And the French and Indian War was basically over on this continent. Now, in England, there was jubilation. Parades in the street, songs were sung, poetry written. General Amherst, who had been the commander at Montreal, was praised as a hero. And William Pitt was at his peak of popularity and power. What could possibly go wrong? 6 weeks later, George II died, and George III became the monarch. Now, he was determined to ruin Pitt. And in his first comments to his Privy Council, he said that he personally was going to take over the war. And Pitt was out. And he also titled Pitt as, and so that people would forget about Pitt. Now, this young king had no experience in warfare. He didn't have any idea how to deal with Parliament. So things were not going well for him, and he didn't end the war right away. That took a while. Now, he was obsessed with reducing debt, actually. And when the war, the 7 Years' War, was ended, he greatly reduced the size of the Royal Navy and the British Army. And then he would go on to other things. Now, he was very, he had a lot on his plate. In his early days, remember, if you watched the coronation and the early installation of our president, King King Charles III, you know that it's a busy time. And it was. So nothing much was getting done except all of this royal stuff. Now, at 22, he would need a queen. And he picked one out. He was very much enamored of a young lady of the British aristocracy. But his mother and Lord Bute refused to allow him his choice. And the king caved, and his mother and Lord Bute won. They argued that he needed a queen from a German principality, and they selected one. She was Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg. They brought her to England, and a few weeks later, she married George III and became Queen of England. Now, she was described as having been accomplished in music and of amiable temperament. And she must have had an amiable temperament because she would bear 15 children. And George III became a devoted husband and a doting father. And throughout his life, his greatest joy was spent in the company of his family. Now, when the king got around, he sort of cobbled together a Tory majority. And after he had reduced the navy and the army, he turned his attention to the colonies as a source of revenue. The British population paid taxes, so why not the colonists? Now, when the new tax was debated, and it was the Stamp Act, there was opposition, and of course, Pitt and the Whigs were opposed. But however, no one was listening to Pitt. But this is a very small item in the history, the British history, but I think it's important. Another member of Parliament rose to speak. He was Colonel Isaac Barry, and that, if you want to look him up, it's B-A-R-R-E acute. He was rough-talking, one-eyed veteran who had been posted and fought in the colonies, had been with General Wolfe at the Plains of Abraham, and he knew America firsthand, and he was devoted to the American cause. No other member of Parliament knew America like Barry did. He knew the geography of the colonies, and he knew the disposition of the colonists. And he warned unequivocally that passage of the Stamp Act would lead to revolution. Now, later, scholars would suggest that the Stamp Act did lead to the revolution. But he predicted this in the fall of 1764, 12 years before the Declaration of Independence. And of course, nobody listened to him. So the Stamp Act was passed, but and there had been other taxes, as J.D. mentioned, but the Stamp Act was different. It would require stamped paper or stamps for everything. And there is a partial list. Diplomas, wills, liquor laws, deeds, leases, mortgages, insurance, bonds, ships charters, customs, newspapers, pamphlets, books, dice, and playing cards. It impacted on business, on the court, and on everyday life. And the reaction was immediate, and J.D. covered this. The customs officers and those in charge were in peril. Some of them found refuge in British ships, and the colonists embargoed British goods. Now in England, factories closed, workers were laid off, and things went downhill, and the Whigs took over the government, determined to repeal the Stamp Act, which they did in March of 66. But the repeal included a declaration of Britain's sovereign right to impose taxes on the colonists. And Parliament would cling blindly to this until they made their way to war. Now, there was a lot of unrest in the colonies over the years. The Boston massacre in March of 1770, a crowd confronted British regulars and shots were fired. A few civilians were dead. Now, this is really not a massacre, but that's what we call it. And it was a public relations disaster. Now, in the fall of 1777, England shipped huge crates of tea to 4 ports in the colonies, including Boston. And they expected the tea to be landed and sold and tax paid. The 16th of December, 1773, 45 tons of tea were dumped in Boston Harbor. And the tea at the other ports were dumped, burned, or otherwise destroyed. The colonists would not be intimidated. Now again, in 1775, Britain sent the British regulars to Lexington and Concord to gather arms and supplies, which were stockpiled there by militia. And they were routed, and the troops headed back to Boston, and on their way they threw down equipment and anything that would impede their progress. Now this was a public embarrassment to the British Army. Now, 2 months later, New Englanders had occupied Breed's Hill, and the British, under William Howe, moved to dislodge and capture them. Now, across the harbor, several high-ranking officers of the British Navy and the British Army, among them Major General John Burgoyne, were prepared to watch the spectacle. Now, it didn't work out the way the British expected, as you know, and the Patriots were dug in behind a rail fence, and as the British appeared, shots were fired, and many of the Patriots fought until they were out of ammunition, and some of them moved back and dug in a little beyond Breed's Hill. And others, like John Starr, who had 800 militia with him, he returned to New England to recruit more militia and train them, because there was no doubt in most people's mind that war was coming. So at Breed's Hill, 450 Americans were killed, wounded, and taken prisoner. But the British casualties were much higher, 1,054, including 59 officers. 2 weeks later, George Washington was selected to command what would become the Continental Army, and the Americans who remained in Boston after Breed's Hill became part of that army. Now, in the winter of 1775-76, Colonel Knox, an artillery officer of the Continental Army, used sledges to move artillery from Ticonderoga to Boston using the frozen Hudson and Connecticut rivers. Now, 59 cannon now pounded the British in Boston, and they evacuated in March. Now, this was another huge embarrassment. In July, Congress issued the Declaration of Independence. And on the 23rd of August, England proclaimed that New England was in a state of rebellion, and the rest of the colonies were declared in rebellion in December. Now, the British, following their loss of Boston, moved and captured New York in early 1776 and would use that to conduct the rest of the war. Now, George Washington was frustrated by enlistment, lack of supplies, and Stacy mentioned that yesterday. And he had a few successes, but then he lost 5 straight battles. He had been pushed out of New Jersey to south of the Delaware River. Now, the British were camped on the north side of the Delaware River, and the British and Hessians. Now, on the 26th of December, George Washington's army approached the south bank of the Delaware River, and they were met by the New England boatmen who provided boats, and they were crossed over to Trenton. They caught the Hessians by surprise, and it was a major win for George Washington. Now, Hessian casualties were 22 killed, including the Hessian general and all 4 of his colonels. 83 were wounded and 900 taken prisoner. Now, at this event, John Stark's militia participated. You'll hear more about John Stark later. Now, the British had failed to confront Washington and defeat him. And Trenton was a reminder that things were serious. So a new approach was needed, and Lord Germain, who was Secretary of the Colonies and conducting the war for the king, finally decided to listen to the generals. Now, Major General John Burgoyne and other military officers had always advocated that they should use the British forces in Canada to move down and attack New England. Burgoyne, finally, who had fought in the North, and he was now not on active duty, and he was partying in downtown London. And he finally got the word across to Lord Germain. And the two met in London and face-to-face planned what would become known as the Saratoga Campaign. Now, Canada had a huge British force. It was really an occupation force because the French were not happy to become part of the British Empire. Now, if any of you have traveled in recent years to the province of Quebec, you know that they're still unhappy about belonging to the British Empire. So that force was huge. So Burgoyne would have lots of troops. That would not be a problem. Now, also in that meeting with Germain promised to alert the troops in New York and have them move up the river, Hudson River, to Albany, while Burgoyne was coming down the river to Albany. Now, I always believed, and I am sure that I studied this in British history years ago, a little more than 80 years ago, so I might be wrong. But I always believed that Germain never mentioned or never gave the orders to the troops in New York. Now, I always run these things past my good friend John Buchanan, and I mentioned that to him in an email, and this is John's reply, quote, "The issue of whether Howe or his surrogate, Clinton, was bound to ascend the Hudson and meet up with Burgoyne at Albany is a matter on which historians who have closely studied the matter disagree. Best to stay away from it." Well, I'm already there, and I guess you're going to have to make up your own mind. Now, when Burgoyne got to Canada on the 6th of May, he found there was a shortage of carts, horses, in fact, everything he needed. And Ashley's presentation yesterday was classic. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong for poor Burgoyne. Now, he asked about 500 horses, and the commander there, Carleton, said that horses were scarce. So Burgoyne got together with the commissary general about how many horses and carts he needed to transport 30 days' provision for his army, which would number over 9,000, and he also had to transport 1,000 gallons of rum. Now, Burgoyne finally submitted a requisition for horses for his artillery and 500 carts needing 2 horses each. But he added that 500 carts would barely carry 14 days' provision. Now, 26 wagons would have to be allocated for baggage belonging to Burgoyne and a few of his staff members. And it would include tents, camp beds, blankets, cooking stoves, dinner china, silver and crystal, fine wine, and Burgoyne's uniforms. Now, I've read at another source that he took with him 2 mistresses and 16 wagons of fine wine. Also, the Hessians that were with him had their families with them. Now, to further complicate it, the wagons that Ashley showed you yesterday were not what was used in Canada. They used carts, which were much lighter. They required 2 horses to pull them, but they could only carry 6 barrels at a time. In addition, Burgoyne had a huge artillery train, 138 guns of various sizes. Small guns would be pulled by men, but the large guns would need at least 2 horses and perhaps more. Now, his source, or his troops, were regulars, provincials, militia, Hessians, and Indians. He would start out with 9,078 white troops. That means they weren't counting the Indians. Now, how long was the wagon train that Burgoyne led out of Canada? Now, I appeal to my friends. Neither Jack Buchanan nor Larry Babbitts could find even an estimate, and they would not hazard a guess. Now, but they both agreed that I should check with Luciter, who is a historian of the period, because they believed that he was correct when he said, well, Burgoyne's failure to assemble adequate vehicles and horses had deleterious logistical and tactical consequences, unquote. That is the understatement of the Revolutionary War. Now, Burgoyne started out on the 17th of June, yes. Now, he had no difficulty moving down along the shore of Lake Champlain. When he got to Fort Ticonderoga, he moved part of his artillery to rise above it, so they were forced to leave, evacuate. Now, after he had taken the fort, he sent about half of that artillery training back to Canada. Obviously, he was having trouble, especially with horses. And as the Patriots headed down the wagon road south, they felled trees behind them, and they burned the bridges. They also burned all of the lumber that was laid across swamps to facilitate the transport of wagons. Burgoyne would have to build 42 bridges. And as the area, near the area, near Bennington, he was desperate for supplies and horses. He sent a detachment of about 900, consisting of German, British, Loyalists, and Indians, commanded by the Hessian Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Baum. Now, the intent was to take as many horses, arms, ammunition, and food as possible, and grain for the horses. Now, this area that he sent these men in was John Stark's enemy area. This is where he and his militia lived. John Stark mustered 1,500 Patriots, militia, and was ready to attack. Now, Baum realized this problem and sent back for reinforcements, and was hoping that because of the rainy weather that Stark would delay an attack. Stark was not about to delay. Now, when he attacked, the orders that he gave to his men were a little unique. He yelled to them, "There are your enemies, the redcoats and Tories. They are ours, or this night Mary's Bolly Stark sleeps a widow," unquote. That's probably apocryphal, but isn't that a great quote? Now, Stark reported his losses at 14 killed and 42 wounded. Baum's force of 900 killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. This was August the 16th, Burgoyne had been unmoving for 2 months. Now, when he was near Bennington, Burgoyne learned that there were no troops moving from New York. He sent a message to Clinton, and Clinton replied and promised him he would start moving, but it would take him about 10 days. It didn't matter. It was already too late. Now, Burgoyne might have had an option of returning to Canada, but he was a professional soldier. He had been ordered to go to Albany, and he would go, and he would continue. Now, I think most of us know what happened in Saratoga. The first battle, which was at Freeman's Field, September the 19th, Benedict Arnold commanded a force of about 700 or more, and he made a stand at the edge of the woods. And they were able to hold off the British long enough for Morgan's Rangers to have an opportunity to shoot from the woods. Now, before the British were able to push the Continentals from their position, many Americans had been killed, but the British losses were 600 killed or wounded, and many of them were officers or NCOs, Morgan's favorite targets, as you know. Now, the British won the battle, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. On the 17th of October, the Battle of Saratoga. Gates' Continental forces, plus his militia, outnumbered Burgoyne's 3-1. Now, there were several units of militia with Gates, including John Stark. And one important British loss at that battle was Simon Fraser, who was killed. supposedly by one of Morgan's riflemen, and he was buried on the field. You've probably seen the painting with the American off to the side and the British burying Simon Fraser on the field with military honors. Well, Gates had the force necessary to surround Burgoyne. So Burgoyne surrendered 6,000 soldiers. Now remember, he had started out with over 9,000, so it had been a rough trip. Now it was expected that those soldiers would be paroled and sent back to England, but they were not. They were interned in a prison camp called Camp Security, which was close to York, Pennsylvania, and held there until the treaty was signed. And Burgoyne was a prisoner of war in America. Later, he would be returned to England as a paroled prisoner of war. Now, as predicted by Pitt and other Whigs, France, Spain, and the Netherlands declared war on Britain, and a new danger lurked. All had large navies, and those nations coveted the wealth of the islands of the West Indies, which were producing vast amounts of sugar, molasses, and rum. Now, England had a virtual monopoly on the slave trade, and had since the reign of Queen Anne in the early 1700s. And the way it worked was that they would load products from West Indies and go to Europe and sell the cargo, then load slave ships in Africa and bring them back to the West Indies to sell them. It was called the Triangle Trade, and that trade produced vast profit for shippers, agents, and owners, and much of that profit would end up with members of Parliament. Now, a new strategy was required to protect that trade. Now, the appeal to Parliament was that England could let New England go if they could take the South. The king would probably not have agreed to that willingly, but the pitch was to Parliament. They didn't really need New England, but the South had what was needed to maintain, build ships for the slave trade and merchant navy, and those ships were wooden and under sail. They needed prime forest with tall trees for masts. They needed lumber, turpentine, and pitch to build or repair ships. They needed hemp for ropes for the rigging and fabric for the sails. And the South had it all in abundance. Also, slaves in the South were producing vast amounts of rice, and that rice could be shipped to the West Indies to feed the slaves growing sugarcane. Now, not having to grow food for their slaves would allow those plantation owners to use that land to plant more sugarcane and increase profits. Now, this was the situation that was described by Robert Stokesbury in his book on the Revolutionary War. Quote, an empire in in North America, which consisted of Hudson's Bay, Newfoundland and Quebec, and Nova Scotia in the north, the Atlantic seaboard from the Chesapeake Bay capes to Florida, and the British West Indies was not to be despised, and would be a reasonable solution to Britain's difficulties. Feeling the pangs of the Industrial Revolution, Britain did not really need the irreconcilably rebellious northern colonies, and might well be better off without them. If the North were lost, so be it. If the South were salvageable, then it should be done soon, unquote. And it was. Parliament, whether motivated by profit or maybe patriotism, voted to provide the funds for the new plan. And that plan was England's southern strategy. They would return to the south. Now that's the end of my story, and it's the beginning of yours. And yours is with Daniel Green and the Southern Campaign, and you all know how that ended. Thank you.
Thank you. So do we have any questions that I can run in? That's
We
amazing.
never
Thank you.
do because it's lunchtime.
Oh, I'm saying that. Yes, ma'am. Hang on, let me bring my tea.
I'm wondering who Burgoyne was traded for.
Excuse me?
The prisoner swap with Burgoyne. Do you remember who?
I'm sorry. I had trouble hearing.
That's what I was wondering. If it was Henry Lawrence.
Who Burgoyne's swap was with? Was it Henry Lawrence?
Did they swap Burgoyne out for somebody else when they let him go back to England?
No, they didn't. As I recall, they swapped Rawdon for Lawrence.
Or Cornwallis?
Burgoyne went back to England, and he was a member of Parliament. And Germain tried to keep him from speaking to Parliament. He couldn't speak to the king because he was on parole. Germain tried to keep him out of Parliament, but Parliament insisted on seating him. And Burgoyne spoke to Parliament and a scathing rebuke for Germain. And now Clinton went back. Clinton was very critical. A lot of them hated Germain, but you had to walk a very fine line. You had to attack Germain, but be careful not to offend the king. That would maybe you lose your head over that one. But I don't think Burgoyne was ever switched for any other prisoners.
Just a couple of comments. Being a New Englander, some of you folks down here may never have been to the Bennington battlefield, which is a hill not unlike Kings Mountain. And the Battle of Bennington unfolded much like Kings Mountain did, in terms that you had a swarming of militia onto semi-regular British troops. In Kings Mountain, they were provincials who were well-trained. They weren't raw militia. And at Bennington, they were regulars. But the same thing happened for much the same reasons. The British at the top of the mountains were shooting down at the militia climbing up the mountains and shooting over their heads, and then trying to do bayonet charges down hills. And the Americans were hot-shotting at the soldiers and decimating them. So very similar results in terms of, in both cases, both battles destroyed a whole wing of the British Army and made it very difficult for them to go forward.
That's a great perspective. Thank you. Peggy Pickett to the rescue. It was Moultrie and Pinckney that were exchanged for Burgoyne.
I enjoyed your talk very much. One question I was wondering, what happened to all that wonderful sterling silver and fine china and wine and all that?
They had consumed most of it before they got to Saratoga, because by then everybody was on half rations. They had run out of most of what they needed before they got to Saratoga. Pardon?
The china and the silver.
Well, I don't know what happened to those diamonds and the silver. It probably ended up on eBay one of these days.
My question is about the Hessians. I
I know they were mercenaries, but did they get involved in the war because of Charlotte and Mecklenburg, the Hessians? Because I know they were all in the South as well. I know they were mercenaries, but was that because of Charlotte?
No, it was, well, yes, possibly, because she was, but so was King George II. And when they were running out of troops, they hired Hessians. They weren't all from Hesse Castle, but we call them all Hessians. And there were initially 30,000, I think. That may have increased later in the war. But yes, there was a very, very strong relationship between King George and his wife Charlotte and German princes. I don't know what the Hessian troops were paid, but the princes from which they were, the principalities from which they were drawn, the princes were well paid, but I don't know how well they paid the men.
Good question. Anything else? Thank you very much, Christine.